The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of a ceiling fan slicing through the thick tension in the air. Officer Mark Daniels sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows on his face. He had spent the last few months working the night shift, a position he once embraced, but now felt more like a slow march through quicksand. Tonight, though, something unexpected was about to jolt him out of his monotony. It started with a case file. A routine one, at first glance, marked with the name Marcus Hayes, a name that didn't ring any bells for Mark. The file had been buried in the department's archives, flagged as closed. But for reasons even he couldn't fully articulate, Mark decided to open it. Perhaps it was boredom, or maybe it was the slight unease that had been gnawing at him all evening, a feeling he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. As he flipped through the papers, his brow furrowed. Marcus Hayes was a local man, a black man whose name had surfaced in a minor investigation years ago. The details were vague, almost deliberately so, but there was enough to paint a picture of a life that had been disrupted by suspicion and scrutiny. It was a story Mark had seen play out too many times before, but something about this one felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it gnawed at him like a splinter buried just beneath the skin. The further Mark dug, the more uneasy he became. The file wasn't just thin. It was suspiciously incomplete. Pages seemed to be missing, and what remained was riddled with contradictions. Reports didn't match up. Witness statements were inconsistent. And then there was the final note, scrawled hastily in the margins of the last page. Asterisk, asterisk, case dismissed. Lack of evidence. Do not reopen asterisk, asterisk. Mark sat back in his chair, his pulse quickening. Something was off. He knew the directive to leave it alone should have been enough to deter him. But instead, it only fueled his curiosity. Against his better judgment, he began searching through the department's internal database, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. That's when he stumbled upon it. A document buried deep in a restricted folder. At first, it didn't make sense. The document wasn't about Marcus Hayes at all. It was about him, Mark Daniels. A termination notice, stamped and signed, detailing his dismissal from the force for misconduct. The words seemed to leap off the screen. Asterisk, asterisk, breach of ethical conduct. Compromising integrity of investigations. Asterisk, asterisk, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't supposed to know about this, and yet, here it was, staring him in the face. Mark's mind raced. Was this some kind of mistake? A sick joke? Or was it something far more sinister? The room suddenly felt colder, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. He looked around nervously, half expecting someone to burst through the door and snatch the file away. But the station was quiet, the hum of the fan the only sound in the room. He couldn't ignore the implications. If this document was real, then someone had gone to great lengths to hide it, and to hide the truth about Marcus Hayes. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than he had anticipated. A web of lies and corruption that could unravel everything he thought he knew. But he wasn't ready for what he would find next. Mark leaned back in his chair, his hand hovering over the mouse as if afraid to click any further. The termination notice felt like a punch to the gut, but it also didn't make sense. He was still employed, still sitting at his desk, still wearing his badge. Why would there be a file stating otherwise? The questions swelled in his mind, each one darker and more confusing than the last. He rubbed his temples, trying to steady his thoughts. He couldn't let panic take over, not yet. The document had to be some kind of mistake, he thought. A glitch in the system, an old file that had been overwritten. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The language was too specific, the details too deliberate. And then there was the connection, or lack of one, to Marcus Hayes. What did this man, a person Mark had never met, have to do with his supposed dismissal? Mark decided to pull up everything he could on Marcus Hayes. The department's database was clunky and slow, but after a few minutes, he found a trail. Marcus had been implicated in a burglary years ago, though the charges were dropped after the evidence fell apart. It wasn't unusual. Cases like that came and went all the time. But Marcus's file didn't feel like just another closed case. There were whispers in the notes, small remarks that hinted at something bigger. Uncooperative witnesses, pressure from above, possible tampering. Mark's eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the details. Tampering. That was a heavy word, one that could mean any number of things. It was also the kind of accusation that could ruin careers. His own career flashed before his eyes, the years he'd spent building his reputation as a reliable by-the-book officer. And yet, here he was, staring at a document that claimed he'd been fired for crossing the very lines he prided himself on avoiding. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the passage of time in slow, deliberate beats. It was nearly midnight now, the station deserted except for the skeleton crew on the other side of the building. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be digging into this. The warning in the file was clear. Asterisk asterisk, to not RDOPE asterisk asterisk. But it was too late to stop now. He needed answers. Digging deeper, Mark found more inconsistencies. Marcus Hayes wasn't just some random name in an old case file. He had a history with the department, one that had been carefully buried. Marcus had filed a complaint years ago, accusing a senior officer of planting evidence to frame him. The complaint had been dismissed, the officer cleared of any wrongdoing. But something about the whole thing felt off. The timelines didn't match up, and the officer in question had retired shortly after the complaint was closed. Mark's stomach churned as he pieced it together. The officer Marcus had accused was one of his old mentors, someone who had taken Mark under his wing when he first joined the force. Captain Richard Sloan. Sloan had been a towering figure in the department, a man who commanded respect and fear. He was also the last person Mark wanted to believe was capable of corruption, but the evidence was starting to paint a different picture. The more Mark read, the clearer it became that Marcus's case had been swept under the rug. Witnesses had been silenced, reports altered, and evidence destroyed. And Sloan was at the center of it all. Mark felt a wave of nausea. If Sloan had been involved in framing Marcus, what else had he been hiding? And why was Mark's own name suddenly tied to this mess? The thought hit him like a freight train. What if Sloan wasn't just hiding his own crimes? What if he was setting Mark up to take the fall? The termination notice, the missing pages in Marcus's file, it all pointed to someone trying to cover their tracks. And Mark was starting to suspect that someone had planned for him to be the scapegoat. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could confront Sloan, but the man was long retired, his reputation still intact. Bringing up old accusations without solid proof would only backfire. Worse, it could put Mark in danger. He had seen what happened to officers who crossed the wrong people in this line of work. Careers ruined, lives destroyed. Mark glanced around the room, his paranoia growing with each passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, even though he was alone. He needed to be careful, needed to move quietly. But first, he needed to know more. He decided to dig into Sloan's records, hoping to find something that could explain the connection between Marcus's case and the termination notice in his own file. The search was slow and frustrating. Sloan's records were heavily redacted, with entire sections blacked out. But there were enough breadcrumbs to piece together a troubling narrative. Sloan had been involved in several controversial cases over the years, many of which ended with the suspects walking free due to lack of evidence. On the surface, it seemed like bad luck or sloppy work. But Mark knew better. Sloan wasn't sloppy. If anything, he was too meticulous. The pattern suggested something far more deliberate. As Mark scrolled through the records, his phone buzzed on the desk, startling him. He grabbed it, his heart pounding. The screen showed an unknown number. For a moment, he hesitated, his finger hovering over the decline button. But curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice tight with nerves. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, gravelly voice. You need to stop what you're doing, Daniels. This isn't a game. Mark's blood ran cold. Who is this? He demanded, though he already knew he wouldn't get an answer. The voice continued, ignoring his question. You're in over your head. Leave the file alone, or you'll regret it. The line went dead before Mark could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. Whoever it was, they knew what he was doing, and they wanted him to stop. But the call only confirmed what he already suspected. He was onto something big, something dangerous. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to the truth. But he also knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone he could trust. But in a department where loyalty could shift with the wind, trust was a rare commodity. As he sat there, grappling with his next move, a new thought crossed his mind, one that sent a fresh wave of fear through him. If Sloane had orchestrated all of this, then he wasn't acting alone. And if Mark kept digging, he might not live long enough to find out who else was involved. Mark's hands trembled as he set his phone down on the desk. The unknown caller's warning was sharp and clear, echoing in his mind like a gunshot. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him. He looked again at the files on his screen, the names and dates blurring together as his mind raced. Someone didn't just want him to stop. They wanted him scared, silenced. His instincts told him to back off, but another part of him, the part that had driven him to wear the badge in the first place, refused to let go. Marcus Hayes' face stared back at him from a grainy mugshot in the file. The man had been dragged through the mud, his life upended by accusations that likely weren't even his to bear. And now Mark was seeing the same wheels of injustice turning. Only this time he was caught in their path. He knew he couldn't go through official channels. The department had too many eyes, too many ears. Even if he tried, his complaint could easily be intercepted or buried, and he'd tip off the wrong people in the process. He needed someone on the outside, someone with limited ties to the force. A name surfaced in his mind. Rachel Carter, a journalist he'd met during a community outreach event. She was known for digging deep into corruption and had a reputation for exposing hard truths. They weren't close, but he remembered her sharp questions and relentless pursuit of facts. If anyone could help him uncover the truth, it was her. Mark grabbed his jacket and left the station, his pulse quickening as he stepped into the cool night air. The city streets were quiet, the distant sound of sirens blending with the hum of streetlights. He glanced over his shoulder, the paranoia from the phone call still fresh in his mind. He drove carefully, taking extra turns and checking his mirrors to make sure he wasn't being followed. The last thing he needed was to lead someone to Rachel. When he arrived at her office, the lights were still on. She was sitting at her desk, her laptop glowing as she typed furiously. Mark hesitated before knocking on the glass door, wondering if he was making a mistake. But when she looked up and saw him, her curiosity was immediate. She waved him in, her eyes scanning him with a mix of concern and intrigue. "What brings you here, Officer Daniels?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. Her tone was casual, but her gaze was sharp. Mark closed the door behind him and took a seat, leaning forward as he spoke in a low voice. "I need your help, Rachel, and this has to stay between us." Rachel raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "All right, what's going on?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think I've stumbled onto something big, something dangerous. It started with an old case, but now it's tied to me, and I don't know how far it goes." She folded her arms, leaning forward with interest. "Dangerous how?" "Corruption, cover-ups." Mark nodded. "Exactly that. There's a man named Marcus Hayes. His case was closed years ago, but I think he was set up. And now there's a file that claims I've been terminated, except I'm still working. Someone's trying to bury something, and they're using me as a shield." Rachel's expression hardened. "Do you have proof?" Mark pulled out a flash drive from his pocket, placing it on her desk. "Everything I've found so far is on there, but it's not enough. I need to know who's pulling the strings, and I need to clear my name." Rachel picked up the drive, her fingers brushing it thoughtfully. If what you're saying is true, this could be huge, but it's also risky. You know that, right? I don't have a choice, Mark said, his voice firm. I can't just walk away from this. She nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes. All right, I'll look into it. But you need to be careful, Mark. If someone's willing to threaten you, they won't stop there. Mark left her office feeling a mixture of relief and dread. He trusted Rachel to dig into the files, but he knew that every move she made would draw attention, and whoever was behind this wouldn't sit idly by while the truth surfaced. Over the next few days, Mark noticed subtle changes around him. Conversations at the station stopped when he walked into a room. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. Even his partner, James, seemed distant, his responses curt and evasive. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, his every move monitored. Late one night, Mark returned home to find his apartment door slightly ajar. His heart sank as he stepped inside, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The living room was untouched, but as he moved deeper into the apartment, he saw the chaos. Papers scattered, drawers pulled open, his laptop missing. Whoever had been here wasn't just looking for something. They wanted him to know they'd been there. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he nearly dropped it as he fumbled to answer. It was Rachel. Mark, she said, her voice tense. You need to get somewhere safe. I've been going through the files, and there's more to this than just Marcus Hayes. There's a whole pattern of cases like his. People of color targeted, evidence fabricated, and the same names keep showing up. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. Who? Sloan, for one, Rachel said. But he wasn't working alone. There are others, current officers, higher-ups. This goes deeper than I thought. Mark felt his chest tighten. What do we do? Rachel paused. We need more proof. And you need to stay out of sight. Whoever's behind this won't stop until they've silenced both of us. Mark looked around his ransacked apartment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had started this journey to find the truth, but now it felt like he was running out of time. The web of corruption was larger than he could have imagined, and he was tangled in its center. Mark paced the dimly lit motel room, his mind racing with everything Rachel had uncovered. The walls seemed to close in on him as he replayed her warning. Asterisk, asterisk, stay out of sight, asterisk, asterisk. But how long could he hide? Every second felt like borrowed time, and the weight of the truth pressed heavily on his chest. He glanced out the window, half expecting a shadow to move or headlights to appear. The paranoia wasn't unfounded. Whoever had broken into his apartment was sending a clear message. His phone vibrated on the small table, and he lunged for it, half expecting Rachel's voice. Instead, the screen flashed with an unfamiliar number. He debated answering but knew he couldn't ignore it. With a deep breath, he swiped to accept the call. Daniels, a voice said, cold and sharp. It wasn't the same one from the previous warning. This voice was calm, deliberate. You don't know what you're dealing with. Mark's pulse quickened. Who is this? That doesn't matter. What matters is that you stop before it's too late. Walk away, and this all ends. Keep pushing, and you'll wish you hadn't. Mark clenched his fist, his anger flaring. I've got nothing left to lose. You've already dragged my name through the mud, broken into my home, and tried to intimidate me. If you think that's going to scare me off, you don't know me. The voice chuckled softly, the sound chilling. You've already lost more than you realize. Check your email, Officer Daniels. Maybe, then you'll think twice. The line went dead before Mark could respond. His stomach churned as he grabbed his laptop and logged in. The email was there, marked with no subject line. He hesitated before opening it, his breath catching as the attachment loaded. Photos. Dozens of them, taken from a distance, him at the station, at Rachel's office, even outside the motel. And then the last image froze his blood. It was Rachel, sitting at her desk, her expression focused. The timer stump was from just an hour ago. Mark's heart raced as he dialed Rachel's number. It rang and rang, the silence between each tone stretching unbearably. Finally, she answered, her voice breathless. "Mark, what's going on?" she asked. "Rachel, listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "They're watching us. They sent me photos of you of me. They know where you are." Rachel cursed softly under her breath. "I'm already moving. I had a feeling they'd try something. Where are you?" "A motel on the edge of town," Mark said, glancing nervously at the door. "You can't come here. It's not safe." "No, but we need to meet," she insisted. "I've been digging deeper, and I found something you need to see. It's not just Marcus Hayes. There's a direct link to your dismissal notice." Mark hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay put. But he couldn't ignore what she was saying. "All right. Where?" Rachel gave him an address, a diner on the outskirts of the city. Mark agreed and hung up, his mind racing with the implications. He packed up quickly, leaving the motel room as discreetly as possible. His car felt like a trap as he drove, every shadow on the road making him jump. He constantly checked his mirrors, scanning for anyone following him. When he arrived at the diner, Rachel was already there, sitting in a booth at the back. She looked tense, her laptop open and papers spread out around her. Mark slid into the seat across from her, his eyes darting around the room. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked quietly. "I don't think so," Mark said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "What did you find?" Rachel leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "This goes beyond Sloan. He was just the beginning. There's an entire network within the department, officers and officials covering for each other. They've been framing innocent people, manipulating evidence and silencing anyone who gets in their way. Marcus Hayes was one of many." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "And my dismissal?" Rachel nodded, sliding a file across the table. "They're using it as leverage. You're a liability now, Mark. They think you've seen too much, that you're too close to exposing them. If they can't scare you off, they'll find a way to take you down." Mark flipped through the file, his hands shaking. Evidence was damning: emails, surveillance reports, even internal memos. It was a conspiracy that reached higher than he ever imagined. And his name was right in the middle of it. "They're going to come after us," Mark said, his voice low. "We need to get this out in the open before it's too late." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "I've already contacted a few people I trust. Independent journalists, advocates. But we need more. If we're going to take them down, we need undeniable proof. Something they can't dismiss or cover up." Mark thought for a moment, his mind racing. The internal database. There's a secure archive at the station. It's where they keep the most sensitive files. Cases, complaints, everything. If we can access it, we'll have everything we need. Rachel looked skeptical. "That's a huge risk. If they catch you..." "They won't," Mark said firmly. "I know the system. I can get in and out before anyone notices." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we're both done." Mark's resolve hardened as he stood, determination burning in his chest. He knew the risks, knew the danger, but he couldn't turn back now. The truth was within reach, and he was willing to risk everything to expose it. As he left the diner, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. Mark drove through the empty streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his mind raced with the plan he and Rachel had hastily crafted. The weight of their mission was immense. Breaking into the station's secure archive wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. But Mark knew it was the only way. The truth was hidden in that database, and if they didn't uncover it soon, the people pulling the strings would erase every trace of their corruption. He parked a few blocks from the station, opting to approach on foot to avoid drawing attention. The air was cold, biting against his skin as he moved through the shadows. His badge was still active, giving him access to the building. But he knew better than to rely on it for long. If anyone saw him, the game would be over. As he slipped through the side entrance, the station was eerily quiet. The graveyard shift officers were likely at their desks or out on patrol, leaving the halls empty. Mark's heart pounded as he made his way toward the archive room, his footsteps barely audible on the tiled floor. He planned every step meticulously, but the creeping paranoia that someone was watching him refused to leave his mind. When he reached the archive door, he pulled out his keycard, praying it would still work. The reader beeped and the lock clicked open. Mark exhaled a shaky breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of computer monitors. He sat at one of the terminals, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the system. The files were vast, a labyrinth of data that seemed impossible to navigate. But Mark knew what he was looking for: case files flagged with certain names, keywords that Rachel had identified. He cross-referenced everything with the Marcus Hayes case, tracing connections between officers, evidence tampering and fabricated reports. The deeper he went, the more damning the evidence became. Sloane's name appeared again and again, along with several high-ranking officials. It wasn't just a few bad cops. It was an organized operation. Mark transferred the files onto a flash drive, his adrenaline surging. But just as he was about to log out, something caught his eye. A file labeled with his badge number. His stomach turned as he opened it. Inside were surveillance photos, phone records, and even private emails. They'd been tracking him for months, documenting his every move. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A report filed by Sloane detailing plans to frame him for obstruction of justice. The report was dated for the following day. He stared at the screen, his mind reeling. They weren't just watching him. They were preparing to take him down. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They were always one step ahead. Mark grabbed the flash drive and stood to leave, but the sound of footsteps outside the door stopped him cold. He froze, his heart pounding as the doorknob rattled. "Who's in there?" A voice called, sharp and authoritative. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't afford to be caught, not now. He glanced around the room, spotting a small vent near the floor. It wasn't ideal, but it was his only option. He dropped to his knees, prying the cover off and squeezing inside. The space was tight, the metal walls pressing against his shoulders as he crawled forward, his breath shallow and rapid. The door to the archive room burst open, and he heard the heavy boots of the officers stepping inside. Mark kept moving, every sound amplified in the confined space. He couldn't see where he was going, but he didn't stop until the vent opened into a maintenance corridor. He climbed out, his body tense and his mind racing. The stakes had just been raised, and he knew he was running out of time. As he exited the station and made his way back to his car, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked, her voice urgent. "I've got the files," he said, his voice strained. "But they know. They're onto us, Rachel. They're planning to pin everything on me." Rachel's silence on the other end spoke volumes. "Then we have to act fast," she finally said. "I've been working on another angle. There's someone on the inside, someone who might be willing to help." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "Who?" "An officer named Linda Torres. She's been quietly passing me information for weeks, but she's afraid to come forward. If we can get her on record, it could be the break we need." Mark's mind raced. Bringing in another person was risky, but they had no choice. "Set up a meeting," he said. "Somewhere safe." Rachel hesitated. "There's one more thing. I found something buried in the files you sent me earlier. It's personal, Mark." His stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I think they've been manipulating you from the start," she said, her voice heavy. "Your connection to Marcus Hayes isn't just coincidence. There's a document suggesting you were assigned to his case specifically because they knew you'd dig too deep. They wanted to use you as a scapegoat all along." Mark felt the world tilt around him. Every decision he'd made, every step he'd taken, it had all been part of their plan. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible, but it also steeled his resolve. If they wanted him to play their pawn, they were about to learn he wasn't going down without a fight. Mark's pulse quickened as he parked in the desolate lot behind the old warehouse where Rachel had arranged the meeting with Linda Torres. The night was unnaturally quiet, the distant hum of the city muffled by the weight of everything at stake. He clutched the flash drive tightly in his hand, its edges digging into his palm like a lifeline. The files it contained were enough to unravel the conspiracy, but only if they could bring them to light. Tonight, everything would be decided. Rachel stood near the entrance, her face pale but determined. When Mark approached, she glanced around nervously. Torres is inside. She's scared, Mark. We need to be careful about how we approach her. Mark nodded, his jaw set. Let's get this done. The longer we wait, the more time they have to stop us. Inside, Linda Torres was pacing near a stack of crates, her hands trembling. She was younger than Mark had expected, her uniform slightly disheveled. When she saw them, her eyes widened, and she stopped mid-step. "You're Mark Daniels," she said, her voice low but steady. "I've heard about you. They've painted you as the villain. But I know the truth." Mark studied her carefully. "If you know the truth, then you know how dangerous this is. Why help us?" Torres hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Because I'm tired of being part of something so rotten. I didn't sign up to protect criminals in uniform. I want to do the right thing, but if they find out I'm here..." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken consequences hanging in the air. Rachel stepped forward. "We'll protect you. But we need your testimony, and we need your help to make this evidence undeniable." Torres nodded reluctantly and pulled a folder from her bag. "This is everything I've gathered. Internal communications, financial records, logs of their movements. It's all here. Combine it with what you've got, and it'll be impossible for them to cover this up." Mark took the folder, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This is enough to bring them down." Before he could say more, the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel made all three of them freeze. Rachel's eyes darted to the door. Someone's here. Torres swore under her breath. "They must have followed me. I was careful, but they're everywhere." Mark's instincts kicked in. "We need to split up. Rachel, get to your car and drive to the safe house. Torres, you stay with me. We'll draw them away." Rachel hesitated but nodded. "Be careful." She slipped out the back door as Mark and Torres moved toward the shadows of the warehouse. The headlights of multiple vehicles illuminated the lot, and figures emerged, armed, shadowy silhouettes that moved with purpose. Mark's mind raced. They weren't here to talk. They were here to end this. He motioned for Torres to stay quiet as he pulled out his phone. Typing quickly, he sent Rachel one last message. **** backup plan. Call the press. You upload everything ****. If they didn't make it out, the truth would still see the light of day." The intruders spread out, their voices low but urgent. Mark counted at least 6 of them, maybe more. He had no weapon, no plan, just the evidence and his resolve. But as they closed in, a sudden commotion erupted at the far end of the warehouse. Shouts echoed, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the ground. The distraction bought them a few precious seconds, and Mark didn't hesitate. Now, he whispered to Torres, pulling her toward a side door. They slipped out into the night, but their escape was short-lived. A figure stepped into their path, gun drawn. It was Sloan. His face twisted into a smirk as he aimed at Mark. "Thought you'd outsmart us, huh? You really don't know when to quit." Mark raised his hands, his mind racing for a way out. "You're not going to shoot me, Sloan. You need me alive to keep this quiet." Sloan laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Alive, sure, but I don't need you unscathed." Before Sloan could act, a deafening roar filled the air as another car sped into the lot. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and Rachel jumped out, wielding what looked like a camera. Flashing lights erupted as she snapped photos, her actions deliberate and bold. "Smile for the press," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everything's being live-streamed. Make a move, and the world will see it." Sloan faltered, his smirk replaced by a scowl. The other men hesitated as well, their confidence shaken. Mark seized the moment, stepping forward. "It's over," he said firmly. "We've got everything, files, testimony, witnesses. You can't bury this anymore." For a moment, the standoff held tension thick in the air. Then, unexpectedly, Sloane lowered his weapon and smiled again. "You think this ends with me? You're playing a game you don't understand." Before Mark could respond, Sloane stepped back into the shadows, his men following. The vehicles roared to life and disappeared into the night, leaving Mark, Rachel, and Torres standing in stunned silence. The relief was short-lived. As Mark turned to Rachel, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, and the text sent chills down his spine. Asterisk, asterisk, you may have won this round, but the game isn't over. Watch your back, asterisk, asterisk. Mark's chest tightened as he realized the fight wasn't finished. They had exposed a part of the corruption, but the network was larger and more insidious than they had imagined. They had struck a blow, but the battle was far from over. And now Mark knew the real danger was just beginning.